Beneath the marble columns and sun-drenched ruins of ancient Greece lies a darker truth that historians rarely dare to whisper. For every temple dedicated to wisdom and beauty, there existed places where the gods unleashed their most terrible wrath. These cursed lands still echo with the screams of those who dared defy divine will. Their very stones soaked in blood and betrayal, from the oracle's cryptic warnings to the vengeful spirits that haunt forgotten battlefields. Greece's shadow history reveals a civilization walking the razor's edge between glory and damnation. Some places should never be disturbed. Some curses never die. In the mist-shrouded mountains of Phocis, where eagles feared to soar, and even the bravest warriors whispered prayers, stood the most terrifying seat of power in the ancient world. The Oracle at Delphi was not merely a temple, but a doorway between realms, where the breath of Apollo himself spoke through mortal lips to deliver prophecies that could topple kingdoms or doom entire bloodlines. Yet what most pilgrims never understood as they climbed those sacred steps was that they were entering a place where divine justice operated by rules far more ancient and unforgiving than any human law. The Pythia, seated upon her tripod above the earth's most sacred chasm, breathed vapors that rose from the very bowels of Hades. These were not mere geological emissions, but the exhalations of the dead, the whispers of souls trapped between worlds, seeking vengeance through the voice of the god's chosen vessel. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of cosmic law, and those who dared ignore her warnings found themselves marked by curses that would echo through generations. King Croesus of Lydia learned this terrible truth when he misinterpreted the oracle's cryptic message about destroying a great empire. The empire he destroyed was his own, and his golden kingdom crumbled to dust, while his family line withered under Apollo's displeasure. The curse followed his descendants across continents and centuries, each generation paying the price for their ancestors' hubris. Some said you could still hear Croesus weeping in the wind that howled through the ruins of Sardis, forever lamenting the day he thought himself clever enough to outwit a god. But Delphi's curses extended far beyond individual kings and queens. The oracle's pronouncements shaped the very geography of Greece itself, marking certain places as forever tainted by divine wrath. She identified the locations where ancient crimes had rent the fabric between mortal and immortal realms, where the blood of innocents had seeped so deep into the earth that the land itself became malevolent. These places became Greece's dark constellation, a map of divine vengeance written across the landscape in suffering and supernatural terror. The priests of Delphi kept meticulous records of these cursed sites, understanding that knowledge of such places was both power and responsibility. They knew which valleys echoed with the screams of the unavenged dead, which islands were shunned by sailors who valued their souls, and which ancient battlefields still claimed the lives of those foolish enough to walk there after sunset. This hidden geography of Greece's cursed places would become the foundation of legends that outlived empires, warning future generations about the terrible price of defying the gods. The oracle's most devastating prophecy concerned a city that would become synonymous with divine retribution. Thebes, the seven-gated citadel that once rivaled Athens in power, carried within its very foundations the seeds of its own destruction. The curse began not with hubris or betrayal, but with an act so horrific that it poisoned the bloodline of its royal house and transformed the city into a beacon for every dark force in the underworld. When young Oedipus arrived at Thebes after unknowingly fulfilling the first half of his terrible prophecy by killing his father at the crossroads, he found a city already marked by supernatural malevolence. The Sphinx, that monstrous guardian with the body of a lion and the face of a woman, had not chosen Thebes randomly for her riddles and slaughter. She was drawn there by the spiritual rot that emanated from the palace. where Queen Jocasta waited unknowingly for her son to claim her as his bride. The plague that eventually consumed Thebes was no ordinary pestilence. Crops withered not from drought, but from the earth's revulsion at the unnatural marriage that defiled the royal bloodline. Children were born twisted and monstrous, their deformities reflecting the corruption that had infected the city's spiritual core. The very air became poisonous, carrying whispers of the dead who refused to rest while such abomination ruled over the living. Citizens reported seeing ghostly figures walking the streets at dawn, pointing accusingly at the palace before dissolving into mist. What made Thebes truly cursed, however, was not just Oedipus's unknowing sins, but the city's response to divine punishment. When the truth was finally revealed, and Oedipus gouged out his eyes in horror, Thebes should have purified itself through proper rituals of atonement. Instead, the citizens chose to cover up the scandal, burying the truth beneath lies and false ceremonies. They crowned Oedipus's sons as if their bloodline carried no taint, pretending that the god's wrath could be appeased through mere political maneuvering. This willful blindness to divine justice sealed Thebes's fate in ways far more permanent than any single act of transgression. The city became a magnet for curses, drawing to itself every supernatural punishment that the gods had scattered across Greece. Warriors who had been cursed elsewhere found their way to Thebes as if compelled by invisible forces. Exiled kings with blood on their hands arrived at its gates, adding their own sins to the city's growing catalogue of divine offences. By the time Oedipus's sons, Eteocles and Polynices, turned their swords against each other, Thebes had become something unprecedented in the ancient world. A city so thoroughly cursed that it existed partially outside the natural order. The famous siege by the Seven against Thebes was not merely a political conflict, but a supernatural reckoning, where mortal weapons clashed with divine wrath in battles that left scars on reality itself. Even today, archaeologists excavating Theban ruins report inexplicable equipment failures and disturbing dreams that drive them to abandon their work, as if the ancient curse still guards its secrets. While Thebes fell victim to its own moral corruption, the island of Crete harboured a different kind of curse, one born not from human sin, but from the gods' deliberate design to create a prison that would contain horrors too terrible for the surface world. King Minos, in his pride, had commissioned the master craftsman Delos to build what he believed would be merely an elaborate dungeon for his wife's monstrous offspring. Neither king nor architect understood that they were constructing something far more sinister, a dimensional maze that would serve as a breeding ground for creatures that should never have existed. The Minotaur was only the most famous of the labyrinth's inhabitants. Deep within its ever-shifting corridors dwelled things that had crawled up from the primordial chaos that existed before the gods imposed order upon the world. Daedalus, in his genius, had accidentally tapped into the raw creative force that the Titans had once wielded, and his labyrinth became a place where the impossible could take physical form. The walls themselves were alive, constantly rearranging to ensure that no mortal who entered could ever find their way out through conventional means. What made the labyrinth truly cursed was not its famous monster, but the fact that it existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Those who entered found themselves not just lost in physical space, but displaced in time itself. Some Athenian youths fed to the Minotaur were discovered decades later, aged only hours, wandering sections of the maze that hadn't existed when they first entered. Others emerged as elderly madmen, claiming to have spent lifetimes in corridors filled with creatures that violated every natural law. The curse extended beyond the labyrinth's walls to infect anyone who came into contact with its secrets. Daedalus himself became trapped by his own creation, not physically but spiritually. His son Icarus's famous fall was not an accident of youthful recklessness, but a desperate escape attempt from the psychological torment of living too close to his father's impossible architecture. The wings of wax and feathers were not just tools of flight, but talismans meant to protect the boy from the labyrinth's dimensional distortions during their escape, even after Theseus supposedly slayed the Minotaur and destroyed the maze. The curse of Crete persisted in ways that revealed the true nature of what Minos had unleashed. Ships that sailed too close to certain areas of the Cretan coast reported their navigational instruments spinning wildly, as if the labyrinth's spatial distortions extended beneath the waves. Fishermen pulled up nets containing fish with impossible anatomies, creatures that seemed to be composed of multiple species, fused together in ways that defied nature's laws. The most chilling evidence of the labyrinth's lingering influence came from the children born on Crete in the generations following its supposed destruction. A disturbing number were born with an uncanny ability to navigate complex spaces, as if they carried some genetic memory of the maze's ever-changing corridors. These children often disappeared during their adolescent years, found days later in underground caves they claimed had opened specifically for them, speaking of voices that called to them in languages that predated human speech. The transformation of Delos from Greece's most sacred birthplace into one of its most cursed locations reveals how even divine favor can become a source of supernatural torment when mortals interfere with cosmic order. This tiny island, no larger than a nobleman's estate, had been chosen by Zeus himself as the only stable land where his pregnant lover Leto could give birth to the twin gods Apollo and Artemis. What should have remained forever blessed became instead a place where the boundary between life and death grew so thin that the living could barely distinguish reality from nightmare. The curse began with the island's elevation to supreme holiness. As pilgrims flocked from across the known world to worship at the birthplace of Apollo, they unknowingly violated the cosmic balance that had made Delos special. The island's spiritual energy, meant to nurture divine life, became overwhelmed by the accumulated prayers, sacrifices, and desperate pleas of thousands of mortals seeking divine intervention. This concentrated spiritual overflow created cracks in the barrier between the mortal world and the realm of the gods, allowing things to seep through that were never meant to walk on earthly soil. The first signs of corruption appeared in the sacred lake where Leto had labored to bring forth the divine twins. The water, once so pure that it was said to reflect not just images but souls, began to show disturbing visions to those who gazed into its depths. Pilgrims reported seeing their own deaths played out in the lake's surface, complete with dates and circumstances that would later prove horrifyingly accurate. Some saw the faces of loved ones who had died years earlier, but these reflections moved independently, mouthing warnings that no one could understand. Unlike other cursed sites that announced their malevolence through obvious supernatural phenomena, Delos maintained its facade of sacred beauty while harboring increasingly sinister secrets. The island's famous lion statues, carved to honor Apollo, began to move subtly during the darkest hours before dawn, turning their stone heads to track the movements of night wandering pilgrims. These movements were so slight that most observers dismissed them as tricks of torchlight, but the guards who maintained the sanctuary learned to avoid looking directly at the statues after sunset, knowing that to meet their shifting gaze was to invite madness. The true horror of Delos lay in its treatment of the dead. The island was so sacred that no one was permitted to die or be born there, forcing pregnant women and the terminally ill to be transported to nearby islands before their moment of transition. This unnatural separation of the island from the fundamental processes of mortality created a spiritual vacuum that attracted the souls of those who had died violently or unjustly throughout the Aegean. These restless spirits, denied the natural rest that should follow death, gathered in growing numbers around Delos, creating an invisible army of the tormented that surrounded the sacred island like a supernatural siege. The priests of Apollo, sworn to maintain the island's purity, found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. They could not acknowledge the supernatural infestation without admitting that their sacred site had become corrupted, yet they could not perform the necessary cleansing rituals without violating the very taboos that made Delos holy. Their solution was to establish a conspiracy of silence that would endure for centuries, training each generation of temple servants to ignore the whispers of the dead and pretend not to see the shadows that moved independently of their sources. While the priests of Delos struggled to contain the supernatural forces that their silence had allowed to fester, the royal citadel of Mycenae faced a curse that fed on violence and grew stronger, with each generation's attempt to break free from its grip. The house of Atreus represented something unprecedented in the catalogue of divine punishments, a bloodline curse that had achieved a form of malevolent consciousness, actively manipulating events to ensure its own perpetuation through an endless cycle of familial murder. The curse had originated with Tantalus, who committed the ultimate sin of serving his own son Pelops as a meal to the gods. Yet what transformed this single act of cannibalistic madness into a multi-generational nightmare was the gods' decision to restore Pelops to life, complete with an ivory shoulder to replace the portion that Demeter had unknowingly consumed. This resurrection created an imbalance in the natural order, leaving Pelops partially divine yet wholly mortal, a walking contradiction that would poison his entire lineage. When Pelops' sons Atreus and Thyestes began their fraternal war over the throne of Mycenae, they unknowingly activated the curse's true power. Atreus, discovering his wife's adultery with his brother, served Thyestes' own children to him at what appeared to be a reconciliation feast. This act of revenge completed a supernatural circuit that had been building for generations, transforming the palace of Mycenae into a kind of cursed engine that would compel each new generation to repeat and amplify the sins of their ancestors. The palace itself became an active participant in the family's destruction. Servants reported that the Great Hall's frescoes depicting heroic hunts would change during the night, showing instead scenes of family members murdering one another in ways that had not yet occurred but would inevitably come to pass. The throne room's floor, made of polished stone, developed stains that could not be cleaned or explained, appearing in patterns that formed maps of future battlefields where family members would die. What made the curse of the House of Atreus truly terrifying was its ability to corrupt the moral reasoning of its victims. Unlike other divine punishments that drove their targets to obvious madness, this curse operated by making evil actions seem not only reasonable but necessary. When Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to appease Artemis, he genuinely believed he was making the noble choice for the greater good. When Clytemnestra murdered her husband in his bath, she was convinced that justice demanded his death. Each generation of the family committed their atrocities while feeling completely justified in their actions. The curse reached its most sophisticated form in the person of Orestes, who found himself caught between two divine commands. Apollo ordered him to avenge his father by killing his mother, while the ancient law of blood demanded that matricide be punished by eternal torment from the Furies. This impossible situation revealed the curse's ultimate goal, not merely to destroy the house of Atreus, but to create a crisis in divine justice itself that would force the gods to restructure the very foundations of moral law to resolve the contradiction their own punishments had created. The cosmic upheaval surrounding Orestes' trial by the ancient gods drew attention to other sites where divine justice had created permanent wounds. In reality's fabric, places where the normal flow of time and natural law had been suspended to accommodate eternal punishments. Mount Sipylus in Lydia stood as perhaps the most haunting example of such divine excess, where a mother's grief had been transformed into a geological feature that continued to weep real tears of salt water for centuries after the original tragedy. Niobe's crime had been the kind of maternal pride that any mortal woman might understand, boasting that her 14 children made her superior to Leto, who had only given birth to Apollo and Artemis. What elevated this common human failing into cosmic significance was the location where she made her boast, standing in the very temple of Leto on Mount Sipylus during the goddess's most sacred festival. Her words, spoken in the presence of hundreds of worshippers, became a direct challenge to divine authority that could not be ignored without undermining the entire structure of religious belief. The punishment that followed revealed something disturbing about the nature of divine justice, its tendency to become self-perpetuating spectacle. Apollo and Artemis could have simply struck Niobe dead alongside her children, but instead they chose to preserve her alive and conscious within the stone of the mountain itself, transforming her into a warning that would terrorize future generations. The goddess Leto, rather than feeling satisfied by this eternal vengeance, seemed to take perverse pleasure in visiting the mountain regularly to mock her rival's suffering. What made Mount Sipylus truly cursed was not just Niobe's presence, but the way her endless grief began to affect the spiritual atmosphere of the entire region. Her tears, flowing constantly from the stone face that had once been her mortal features, carried with them the concentrated essence of maternal anguish that proved toxic to living mothers. Women who lived in the shadow of the mountain found themselves overwhelmed by irrational fears for their children's safety, often becoming so protective that they inadvertently caused the very tragedies they sought to prevent. The mountain's curse operated through a kind of emotional contagion that spread far beyond its immediate vicinity. Traders who passed through the region carried with them an inexplicable melancholy that infected their home cities like a spiritual plague. These merchants would return to their families only to find themselves unable to feel joy at their children's accomplishments, always haunted by visions of loss and death that seemed to emanate from the very stone they had unknowingly absorbed during their travels. Local priests attempted to contain the curse by establishing rituals of emotional purification for anyone who had approached the mountain. But these ceremonies proved insufficient against the supernatural force of Niobe's perpetual mourning. The goddess's grief had achieved a kind of metaphysical weight that bent space around itself, creating pockets where time moved differently and where the boundary between past and present became permeable. Visitors to the mountain often reported hearing the voices of Niobe's children calling out from within the stone, their cries growing louder during the hours when Apollo's chariot passed closest to the peak, as if the god's presence awakened fresh anguish in their mother's transformed heart. The emotional contamination spreading from Mount Sipylus paled in comparison to the physical corruption that had transformed the Stymphalian marshes from a pristine wetland into a feeding ground for creatures that violated every natural law governing the relationship between predator and prey. These were not ordinary birds driven to unusual behavior by supernatural influence, but entities that had been fundamentally altered by prolonged exposure to the raw creative force that the gods used to shape reality according to their will. The marshes had originally served as a retreat for Artemis, a place where the goddess of the hunt could meditate on the balance between life and death that governed the natural world. But when the goddess began using the isolated wetlands to dispose of mortals who had offended her, their blood and decomposing flesh created a kind of alchemical reaction with the marsh's spiritual energy. The local bird population, feeding on this divinely tainted carrion, underwent a transformation that turned them into living weapons with bronze beaks and metallic feathers sharp enough to pierce armor. What made the Stymphalian birds truly terrifying was their collective intelligence, which seemed to increase exponentially with their numbers. Individual birds displayed typical animal cunning, but when they gathered in flocks, they demonstrated strategic thinking that surpassed many human generals. They learned to coordinate their attacks with mathematical precision, using geometry and timing that suggested access to knowledge no natural creature should possess. Some scholars theorized that the birds had become a kind of distributed consciousness, with each individual serving as a neuron in a vast aerial brain. The curse of the Stymphalian marshes extended beyond the birds themselves to affect anyone who entered their territory with hostile intent. Hunters who came seeking to kill the creatures found their weapons turning against them with supernatural malevolence. Arrows would change direction mid-flight to strike their own archers, while spears would writhe in their wielders' hands like serpents. The marshes themselves seemed to shift their geography to trap intruders, with familiar paths leading to unexpected dead ends and safe islands suddenly becoming quicksand bogs. The most disturbing aspect of the Stymphalian curse was its tendency to corrupt the moral nature of those who survived encounters with the birds. Veterans who had faced the creatures and lived reported a growing appetite for violence that went far beyond normal warrior instincts. They described dreams where they soared above battlefields, looking down on human conflicts with the detached hunger of predators selecting prey. Some of these survivors eventually abandoned human society entirely, disappearing into remote wilderness areas where they were occasionally glimpsed by travelers who described figures that moved with unnatural speed and seemed to cast shadows shaped like wings. Even Heracles, when he completed his labor of driving away the Stymphalian birds, had been fundamentally changed by the experience. Those close to the hero noted that he became increasingly prone to bouts of savage rage that seemed to echo the bird's predatory nature. His later massacre of his own family, traditionally blamed on Hera's madness, inducing curse, may have been influenced by the psychological corruption he had absorbed during his time in the marshes, suggesting that some divine punishments could infect even the gods' chosen champions with their malevolent influence. The corruption that had infected even Heracles through his encounter with the Stymphalian birds found its most concentrated expression at Aulis, where the greatest hero of his generation would commit an act so fundamentally evil that it would transform a simple harbour into a nexus of supernatural vengeance. King Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia created something unprecedented in the catalogue of cursed places, a location where the boundary between divine and mortal justice had been permanently shattered by an act that satisfied neither. Artemis had demanded the sacrifice to provide favourable winds for the Greek fleet's journey to Troy. But what the goddess truly sought was not Iphigenia's death, but Agamemnon's spiritual destruction, the king's willingness to murder his own child, for the sake of military glory, revealed a moral emptiness that made him the perfect instrument for the goddess's larger plan to corrupt the entire concept of heroic warfare. The altar at Aulis became a kind of spiritual anvil where noble ideals were hammered into twisted parodies of themselves. The harbour's curse manifested not through obvious supernatural phenomena, but through its ability to reveal the true nature of anyone who stood upon its shores. Ships that docked at Aulis found their crews inexplicably turning against one another over trivial disputes that escalated into blood feuds. Merchants who had traded there for years suddenly began cheating their oldest customers, while priests found themselves questioning the very gods they served. The place had become a mirror that showed people the worst possible versions of themselves and then compelled them to act upon those dark reflections. What made Aulis uniquely dangerous was its temporal instability caused by the collision between Artemis's divine will and a father's unnatural crime. Time itself had been wounded by Iphigenia's sacrifice, creating pockets where past and future existed simultaneously. Visitors to the harbour reported seeing phantom fleets departing for wars that had already ended, while others witnessed their own deaths played out by spectral figures who bore their faces, but moved with the jerky motions of marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The most chilling aspect of Aulus's curse was its effect on children. Young people who approached the harbour began experiencing prophetic dreams that showed them the exact moment and manner of their parents' deaths. These visions were invariably accurate, but they came with a terrible compulsion. The children felt an overwhelming urge to prevent these deaths through any means necessary, often leading them to commit the very acts of violence they had sought to avoid. The curse had created a feedback loop of patricidal and matricidal impulses that spread like a contagion through families who had any connection to the harbour. Local fishermen learned to avoid the waters near the altar after discovering that fish caught in those areas induced madness in anyone who consumed them. The fish themselves appeared normal, but their flesh carried traces of the spiritual poison that had seeped into the harbour's ecosystem from Iphigenia's spilled blood. Those who ate these tainted fish reported vivid hallucinations of their loved ones, transforming into monsters before their eyes, followed by an irresistible compulsion to attack these perceived threats with whatever weapons came to hand. The madness spreading from Aulis found its perfect complement in the architectural nightmare that Thebes had become after generations of accumulated curses transformed its famous 7 gates into something far more sinister than mere defensive structures. Each gate had evolved into a supernatural checkpoint where different aspects of divine punishment manifested, creating a city that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of suffering and trapped its inhabitants in an endless cycle of spiritual torment. The curse affecting Thebes's gates had begun with the city's original sin of harbouring Oedipus's polluted bloodline, but it achieved its final form during the siege by the 7 against Thebes. Each attacking champion who died before a specific gate left behind a spiritual imprint that merged with the stone and bronze of the fortifications, transforming them into living monuments to different types of divine wrath. The gates no longer simply controlled physical access to the city, but served as filters that sorted souls according to their moral failings. The Proetid Gate became known for its ability to detect lies, causing liars who passed through it to speak only truth for the remainder of their lives, a curse that proved more devastating than death for politicians and merchants. The Electran Gate induced temporary blindness in anyone who had committed adultery, while the Nystan Gate caused murderers to hear the voices of their victims whispering accusations that only they could perceive. These punishments seemed merciful compared to the transformations inflicted by the other gates, each of which reflected the particular obsessions of the hero who had died defending it. What made the gates truly cursed was their tendency to malfunction, applying their supernatural judgments to innocent people, while allowing genuine criminals to pass undetected. A faithful wife might be struck blind by the Electran Gate due to impure thoughts she had never acted upon, while a serial killer could walk through unaffected because his crimes had been committed in a state of madness that the gate did not recognize as moral culpability. The gates had become unreliable arbiters of justice that inflicted random punishments based on criteria that no living person could understand or predict. The city's inhabitants learned to navigate these hazards through elaborate rituals of spiritual preparation before approaching any gate, but these ceremonies proved insufficient against the gates, increasing instability. Citizens reported that the gates had begun communicating with each other, sharing information about the moral status of individuals in ways that created citywide networks of supernatural surveillance. A person judged favorably by one gate might find themselves marked for punishment by another, as if the defensive structures were competing to see which could inflict the most creative forms of divine justice. The ultimate horror of the seven gates revealed itself during times of crisis, when their individual curses would synchronize to create city-wide phenomena that defied natural explanation. During plagues, the gates would seal themselves automatically, trapping the healthy inside with the diseased while preventing any escape or outside assistance. During famines, they would allow only the most morally corrupted individuals to leave, ensuring that virtue and vice became literally matters of life and death. The gates had transformed Thebes from a city into a kind of divine experiment in applied moral philosophy, with its citizens serving as unwilling test subjects in investigations of justice that stretched the boundaries of sanity itself. While the gates of Thebes trapped their victims through moral judgment, Cape Malea on the southern tip of the Peloponnese had evolved into something far more immediately lethal, a maritime curse that transcended simple shipwrecks to become a supernatural phenomenon that existed partially outside normal space and time. Sailors throughout the Mediterranean whispered that the Cape was not merely dangerous but actively malevolent, capable of reaching out across vast distances to claim vessels that had never intended to approach its treacherous waters. The curse had originated from the gods' punishment of mortals who had attempted to bypass their authority by creating alternative trade routes that avoided temple taxes and religious obligations. Poseidon, offended by this commercial impiety, had twisted the Cape's geography into an impossible maze of sea caves and underwater passages that seemed to shift according to the gods' whims rather than any natural law. Ships that approached the Cape often found themselves sailing in circles for days, their compasses spinning wildly, while their crews slowly went mad from the sound of voices calling to them from beneath the waves. What distinguished Cape Malea from other hazardous waters was its ability to manifest phantom duplicates of itself throughout the Mediterranean, creating multiple versions of the same cursed landmark that could appear anywhere sailors felt confident in their navigation. Experienced captains would recognize the Cape's distinctive silhouette rising from waters where no land should exist, knowing that they had somehow been transported to the original cursed site regardless of their intended destination. These phantom manifestations followed no pattern that human logic could decipher, appearing most often to ships whose crews had committed acts of hubris or impiety during their voyages. The Cape's supernatural influence extended beneath the sea itself, where drowned sailors from across centuries had gathered to form a kind of underwater city of the dead. These phantom crews continued to sail their spectral vessels through the submerged passages that connected Cape Malea to every other body of water in the known world, emerging during storms to drag living sailors down to join their eternal voyage. Survivors of encounters with these ghost ships described crews whose bodies showed signs of drowning from multiple different eras, as if death at Cape Malea existed outside the normal flow of time. The most terrifying aspect of the Cape's curse was its tendency to infect the memories of those who survived encounters with it. Sailors who had approached the cursed waters would find their recollections constantly shifting, with details of their experience changing each time they tried to recount what had happened. Some remembered sailing through calm seas under sunny skies, while others insisted they had battled supernatural storms filled with creatures that violated every natural law. These contradictory memories suggested that Cape Malea existed in multiple realities simultaneously, with survivors' minds struggling to process experiences that had occurred in dimensions where different physical laws applied. Even more disturbing were the reports from families of sailors who had never returned from voyages near Cape Malea. These relatives claimed to receive visits from their lost loved ones, who would appear at their doors speaking of ongoing adventures in waters that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight. These phantom sailors bore messages about treasure islands and new lands that could only be reached by those who had already died at sea, suggesting that the Cape's curse offered its victims a form of immortality that came at the cost of ever again touching solid ground or experiencing the normal passage of time. The phantom sailors who visited families from Cape Malaya's cursed waters carried tales that bore disturbing similarities to reports from Mycenae, where Agamemnon's tomb had become a nexus for the dead who refused to accept the finality of their earthly existence. Unlike other burial sites that served as peaceful resting places for departed souls, the great king's final resting place had transformed into a kind of supernatural embassy where the deceased could negotiate with the living world, demanding justice for wrongs that had never been properly addressed. The tomb's curse had not originated with Agamemnon's death, but with the circumstances of his burial. Clytemnestra, having murdered her husband in revenge for Iphigenia's sacrifice, had been forced by political necessity to provide him with royal funeral rites, while simultaneously attempting to bind his spirit to prevent posthumous vengeance. The contradictory magical workings employed during his burial created a spiritual paradox that allowed Agamemnon to exist simultaneously as both a properly honored king and a restless ghost demanding satisfaction. What made the tomb uniquely dangerous was its function as a gathering place for other spirits who had been denied proper justice during their lifetimes. These phantoms were drawn to Agamemnon's unresolved rage like moths to flame, creating a supernatural court where the dead could present their cases for divine intervention. The king's ghost served as a kind of infernal judge, weighing the merits of each spirit is claim, and occasionally granting them temporary return to physical form to pursue their unfinished business among the living. The tomb's influence extended far beyond the spirits, who gathered there to the living descendants of those who had wronged the dead. Families throughout the Greek world found themselves haunted by ancestors they had never known, victims of crimes committed generations earlier, who had finally found a supernatural advocate willing to press their cases. These hauntings followed no pattern of family guilt or innocence, striking randomly at bloodlines that had forgotten their own dark histories until the dead arrived to remind them. Local priests discovered that traditional burial rites had become ineffective for anyone who died within a day's journey of Agamemnon's tomb. The recently deceased would arrive at the tomb's entrance, regardless of where they had been interred, compelled by forces that overrode even the most sacred funeral ceremonies. These newly dead spirits would petition Agamemnon for permission to remain active in the mortal world, creating an ever-growing army of phantoms who served the dead king's quest for cosmic justice. The most chilling aspect of the tomb's curse was its effect on the concept of death itself in the surrounding region. Children born near Mycenae displayed an uncanny ability to communicate with deceased relatives, often carrying on conversations with grandparents they had never met while providing detailed accounts of family secrets that had died with previous generations. These children served as unwilling mediums for Agamemnon's supernatural court, allowing the dead king to gather intelligence about the living world that he used to identify new targets for his expanding campaign of posthumous vengeance. The boundary between life and death had become so permeable around the tomb that some families found it impossible to determine which of their relatives were actually still alive. While Agamemnon's tomb drew the dead toward unfinished business with the living, the island of Lemnos had achieved an even more disturbing form of supernatural corruption, a place where divine punishment had created a society that existed in active defiance of natural law. The island's women had murdered every male inhabitant in a single night of coordinated slaughter. Yet rather than facing divine retribution for their crimes, they had been granted a form of immortality that allowed their bloodthirsty matriarchy to endure indefinitely. The curse had begun with the women's neglect of Aphrodite's worship, which caused the goddess to afflict them with a supernatural stench that drove their husbands to seek comfort with Thracian slave women. Rather than accepting this punishment or seeking proper atonement, the women of Lemnos had chosen to interpret their abandonment as justification for total war against the male sex. Their coordinated massacre of every man and boy on the island had been planned with a precision that suggested supernatural guidance, as if some malevolent force had provided them with tactical knowledge beyond normal human capabilities. What made Lemnos truly cursed was not the initial act of mass murder, but the island's subsequent transformation into a kind of experimental society that operated according to rules that violated every natural principle governing human reproduction and social organization. The women had discovered that they could sustain their population through supernatural means that did not require male participation, giving birth to daughters who emerged fully grown and possessed complete memories of lives they had never actually lived. These phantom children carried within them the accumulated hatred of their artificial mothers, ensuring that each new generation was more violent and misanthropic than the last. The island's curse extended to any man who attempted to land on its shores, regardless of his intentions or moral character. Even heroes like Jason and his Argonauts, who arrived seeking only shelter and supplies, found themselves subjected to supernatural compulsions that transformed them into unwilling participants in the women's reproductive experiments. The island's atmosphere was so thoroughly saturated with divine malevolence that it could override the free will of even the most strong-minded visitors, turning them into temporary slaves who served purposes they could never consciously accept. The women of Lemnos had developed a form of collective consciousness that allowed them to function as a single organism dedicated to the corruption of masculine virtue. They could share memories and emotions instantaneously, coordinate their actions without verbal communication, and even transfer their individual consciousness between bodies when physical death threatened one of their number. This hive mind mentality made them perfect instruments for spreading their curse beyond the island's borders, as any man who survived an encounter with them carried away a spiritual infection that would gradually corrupt his relationships with other women. The most terrifying aspect of Lemnos was its function as a prototype for what divine punishment could achieve when it abandoned traditional concepts of justice in favor of pure experimentation with human nature. The island served as a testing ground where the gods could observe how far social structures could be twisted before they collapsed entirely, using the women as unwitting laboratory subjects in investigations of gender, power, and violence that pushed the boundaries of what constituted human society. The curse had created not just a place of supernatural horror, but a preview of possibilities that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying all civilized life. The experimental horrors of Lemnos paled in comparison to the psychological devastation wrought by the Oracle at Trophonius, where divine prophecy had evolved from a source of guidance into a form of spiritual torture that systematically destroyed the sanity of anyone seeking knowledge of the future. Unlike other oracular sites that delivered their revelations through cryptic riddles or symbolic visions, Trophonius forced suppliants to experience their prophetic visions as if they were living through actual events, creating a form of temporal displacement that left survivors unable to distinguish between past, present, and future. The oracle's curse had originated with Trophonius himself, a master builder who had attempted to cheat death by hiding in an underground chamber of his own construction. The gods, offended by this presumption, had transformed him into an earth spirit bound to reveal the future to anyone brave enough to descend into his subterranean domain. However, the process of becoming an oracle had driven Trophonius completely insane, and his madness infected every prophecy he delivered, turning divine revelation into a form of psychological warfare against mortal consciousness. What distinguished the oracle at Trophonius from other cursed sites was its requirement that suppliants undergo a ritual preparation that lasted for days, during which they were systematically isolated from all human contact and fed a diet designed to weaken their mental defenses. By the time they descended into Trophonius's cave, they had been reduced to a state of psychological vulnerability that made them perfect receptacles for visions that would have driven healthy minds to immediate madness. The oracle had become a machine for the controlled demolition of human sanity. The cave itself existed in a state of dimensional instability that reflected Trophonius's fractured mental condition. Suppliants who descended into its depths found themselves experiencing multiple possible futures simultaneously, with each vision carrying the full emotional and physical impact of lived experience. They might witness their own death from old age while simultaneously experiencing their violent murder and their transformation into a supernatural entity, with each timeline feeling equally real and immediate. The human mind was simply not equipped to process such contradictory realities without suffering permanent damage. Those who survived their encounter with Trophonius emerged as fundamentally altered beings who could no longer function in normal society. They possessed perfect knowledge of future events, but lacked the ability to distinguish between prophetic visions and ordinary memories, often treating things that had not yet happened as if they were long past experiences. These oracle survivors became living paradoxes who existed partially outside the normal flow of time, aging at unpredictable rates and occasionally vanishing entirely from the present, only to reappear decades later, with no awareness that any time had passed. The most disturbing aspect of the Trophonius oracle was its tendency to create prophetic visions that became self-fulfilling through the very act of revelation. The mad god seemed to take perverse pleasure in showing suppliants futures that would only come to pass because they had seen them, trapping them in causal loops where their knowledge of destiny became the mechanism that ensured its fulfillment. The oracle had transformed prophecy from divine gift into cosmic joke, using the human desire for knowledge as a weapon to demonstrate the ultimate futility of mortal attempts to understand or control their fate. The causal paradoxes unleashed by the oracle at Trophonius found their most devastating expression on the island of Aegina, where Zeus himself had created a curse so fundamentally unjust that it challenged the very concept of divine morality. Unlike other cursed places that resulted from human transgression or divine punishment of specific crimes, Aegina's torment arose from the gods' jealousy of mortal happiness, transforming paradise into purgatory simply because its inhabitants had achieved a level of contentment that offended divine pride. The island had originally been blessed with perfect harmony between its human and natural inhabitants. The Aeginetans had developed a society based on cooperation with the island's ecosystem rather than domination over it, creating a civilization that existed in balance with natural law. Their ships sailed without damaging the sea. Their agriculture flourished without depleting the soil, and their children grew up free from the violence and corruption that plagued other Greek communities. This very perfection had attracted Zeus's attention and ultimately his wrath. The god's curse took the form of a plague that killed every living creature on the island except for the ants, which Zeus then transformed into a new human population called the Myrmidons. However, this apparent act of mercy concealed a trap of cosmic proportions. The ant people retained their original insect consciousness alongside their new human awareness, creating a population that thought and acted as a collective organism. rather than as individuals. They could not experience personal love, individual ambition, or private sorrow, existing instead as components of a larger entity that served Zeus's will with mechanical efficiency. What made Aegine's curse uniquely horrifying was its gradual revelation that the Myrmidons were not truly alive, but rather sophisticated automatons animated by fragments of Zeus's own consciousness. They possessed no souls of their own, but served as extensions of the god's will, allowing him to experience mortal existence vicariously while remaining safely divine. The island had become Zeus's personal laboratory for exploring human emotions and experiences, without risking any genuine divine investment in mortal affairs. The Myrmidons' artificial nature became apparent through their inability to truly die. When killed in battle, they would simply regenerate from the island's ant population, emerging with identical memories and personalities, but no continuity of individual consciousness. This revelation transformed every relationship on the island into a form of elaborate theatre, with the Myrmidons playing roles they could never truly feel while Zeus observed their performances like a child manipulating dolls in an elaborate game. The curse's most insidious aspect was its effect on visiting mortals, who found themselves gradually losing their individual identity the longer they remained on Aegina. The island's atmosphere was so thoroughly saturated with Zeus's consciousness that it slowly overwrote the personal thoughts and feelings of anyone who stayed too long, transforming them into additional components of the god's collective experiment. Sailors who landed at Aegina planning brief visits would find themselves unable to remember why they had wanted to leave, eventually forgetting their original identities entirely as they became absorbed into the island's artificial society that existed solely for Zeus's entertainment. While Zeus's experiment on Aegina demonstrated the god's capacity for sustained psychological manipulation, the Veil of Tempe revealed their tendency toward explosive violence that could permanently scar the landscape itself. This narrow gorge between Mount Olympus and Mount Ossa had been transformed into a supernatural battlefield where Apollo's pursuit of the nymph Daphne continued to play out in an endless loop of divine obsession, creating a place where the past refused to remain past and the consequences of unrequited love achieved physical manifestation. The curse had begun with Apollo's arrogant boast that he was superior to Eros in matters of love and warfare, prompting the younger god to demonstrate his power by striking Apollo with a golden arrow of desire, while simultaneously hitting Daphne with a lead arrow of revulsion. However, the divine nature of both arrows meant that their effects could not fade with time or distance, creating a perpetual chase scene that transcended the normal boundaries between myth and reality. The Veil had become a stage where the same tragic drama played out continuously, with phantom versions of the god and nymph reenacting their fateful encounter for eternity. What made the Veil of Tempe uniquely dangerous was its temporal instability, caused by the collision between Apollo's divine will and Daphne's desperate prayers for escape. Time itself had been fractured by the impossibility of resolving the conflict between the god's desire and the nymph's transformation into a laurel tree, creating pockets where different moments from their chase existed simultaneously. Travelers through the Veil might witness Apollo's initial approach, Daphne's flight, and her final transformation happening in the same instant, overwhelming their senses with contradictory visual information that drove many observers to madness. The Veil's curse extended beyond mere temporal confusion to affect the fundamental nature of desire itself within its boundaries. Mortals who entered the gorge found their own romantic feelings amplified to supernatural intensity, experiencing love and hatred with a force that their human hearts could not contain. These artificially enhanced emotions proved inevitably destructive, driving previously stable couples to murder, suicide while inspiring eternal bachelor, to commit acts of desperate passion that violated every social and moral boundary. The most disturbing aspect of the veil's curse was its effect on the local plant life, which had absorbed the spiritual residue of Daphne's transformation and Apollo's frustrated desire. Trees throughout the gorge developed a form of consciousness that allowed them to move independently, often pursuing human visitors with the same relentless obsession that Apollo had shown toward Daphne. These ambulatory trees would attempt to embrace unwary travelers, gradually absorbing them into their bark, as if trying to recreate the nymph's escape through transformation. The veil had also become a magnet for other victims of unrequited love, both mortal and divine, who were drawn to the site by forces they could not understand or resist. These love-mad pilgrims would arrive from across the Greek world, compelled to reenact their own romantic tragedies within the veil's cursed boundaries. Over time, their accumulated emotional energy had created a supernatural storm of passion that raged constantly through the gorge, manifesting as winds that carried the voices of lovers calling out for partners who could never answer, creating a cacophony of desire that could drive even the most rational minds to acts of desperate romanticism that inevitably ended in tragedy. The romantic obsessions that plagued the Vale of Tempe found their most calculated expression in distant Colchis, where love had been weaponized into an instrument of political and supernatural warfare. Unlike other cursed places that had evolved their malevolent properties over time, Colchis had been deliberately designed as a trap for heroes, with every aspect of its culture and geography engineered to transform noble quests into exercises in moral corruption that would destroy both the heroes themselves and everything they held dear. The golden fleece that hung in Ares' sacred grove was not merely a treasure, but a spiritual magnet that drew to itself the accumulated guilt and ambition of everyone who coveted it. The fleece had been created from the skin of the ram that had carried Phrixus to safety, but its golden properties came from its saturation with the dying prayers of countless sacrifice victims whose blood had been spilled in Ares' honor. Each thread of the fleece carried within it the concentrated essence of violence and betrayal, making it irresistible to warriors while simultaneously corrupting anyone who came into contact with it. King Aeetes had transformed his entire kingdom into an extension of the fleece's curse, creating a society where magical knowledge was used exclusively for destructive purposes and where family bonds existed only to be exploited for political advantage. His daughter Medea represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a sorceress whose powers were so thoroughly grounded in violation of natural law that she could only maintain her abilities by continuously committing acts that deepened her spiritual corruption. The kingdom had become a machine for manufacturing moral monsters. What made Colchis uniquely dangerous was its ability to corrupt heroes not through obvious temptation, but through the gradual erosion of their moral foundations. Jason and his Argonauts had arrived as noble adventurers seeking glory through legitimate quest, but the kingdom's atmosphere slowly transformed their mission into an exercise in theft, betrayal, and abandonment of sacred obligations. The fleece's influence made every compromise seem reasonable, and every act of treachery appeared justified until the heroes found themselves capable of acts they would have found abhorrent before entering Colchis's borders. The curse of Colchis operated through a form of spiritual alchemy that transmuted virtue into vice through seemingly minor moral adjustments. Heroes who would never consider murdering innocents found themselves willing to kill guards who were simply doing their duty. Warriors who prized honor above life discovered themselves breaking oaths and abandoning allies when the fleece's influence made such betrayals seem strategically necessary. The kingdom had perfected the art of moral corruption through gradual compromise rather than dramatic temptation. The most terrifying aspect of the Colchian curse was its export potential, carried by anyone who had been exposed to the fleece's influence for extended periods. Medea's subsequent journey to Greece brought with her a spiritual contamination that would infect everyone she encountered, turning her marriage to Jason into a vector for spreading Colchis's corrupting influence throughout the Greek world. Her children, born from the union of heroic virtue and supernatural malevolence, represented a new form of cursed being that carried within their very blood the power to transform noble societies into reflections of their mother's homeland, where love and loyalty served only as tools for manipulation and revenge. The corrupting influence that Medea carried from Colchis to infect the Greek world had its ultimate source in the most fundamental of all cursed waters, the river Styx, whose springs in the mountains of Arcadia served as the nexus between the mortal world and the realm of the dead. Unlike other supernatural waterways that had been corrupted by human sin or divine punishment, the Styx represented something far more dangerous, a natural phenomenon that existed before the gods themselves, a primordial force that the Olympians had attempted to harness, but never truly control. The springs that fed the Styx bubbled up from depths that connected directly to the foundations of reality itself, carrying with them the raw essence of binding and oath, making that predated any organized system of divine justice. When the gods swore by the Styx, they subjected themselves to laws older than their own existence, forces that could compel even Zeus to honor agreements that worked against his own interests. The water's power to enforce absolute truth had made it invaluable for divine diplomacy, but its presence in the mortal world created a point of dangerous instability where cosmic law intersected with human frailty. What made the Styx springs uniquely cursed was their tendency to leak temporal paradoxes into the surrounding landscape. The water existed simultaneously in past, present, and future, carrying with it echoes of every oath that had ever been sworn or would ever be made. Mortals who approached the springs often found themselves witnessing ghostly reenactments of divine agreements from ages past, while occasionally glimpsing negotiations that would not take place for centuries to come. The area had become a kind of temporal crossroads where the linear flow of time broke down entirely. The springs' curse manifested most dramatically in their effect on human attempts at oath, making any vow spoken within hearing distance of the bubbling waters would be magnified to cosmic significance, binding the oath maker with supernatural force that made violation literally impossible. Local shepherds learned to avoid the area during wedding seasons after several bridegrooms had been struck dead for harboring momentary doubts during their marriage ceremonies, their hearts stopped by the Styx's refusal to tolerate even the slightest mental reservation in matters of sworn commitment. The most terrifying aspect of the Styx springs was their apparent consciousness, a malevolent awareness that seemed to take pleasure in trapping mortals within the letter of agreements they had never intended to make binding. The springs would amplify casual remarks into formal oaths, transform rhetorical questions into sworn commitments, and interpret metaphorical language with deadly literalism. Travelers who had spoken carelessly near the waters often found themselves compelled to fulfill promises they had made in jest, driven by supernatural force to complete tasks that might take lifetimes to accomplish. Even more disturbing were the reports of the springs' ability to create retroactive oaths, binding people to agreements they had never actually made, but that the waters insisted they had sworn in moments of distraction or sleep. These phantom commitments carried the same supernatural weight as genuine vows, creating obligations that could override free will and transform innocent people into unwilling servants of cosmic law. The Styx had become a place where the very concept of voluntary agreement had been perverted into a tool for entrapment that operated according to rules no mortal mind could fully comprehend. The binding power of the Styx springs paled in comparison to the psychological chains forged on Mount Helicon, where the 9 muses had established their earthly residence and transformed the pursuit of artistic inspiration into a form of spiritual slavery that consumed the souls of mortals foolish enough to seek divine creativity. Unlike other cursed places that announce their dangers through obvious supernatural phenomena, Helicon lured its victims with the promise of transcendent beauty while concealing the terrible price that such elevation of human consciousness required. The mountain's curse operated through what appeared to be generous divine patronage. Artists, poets, and musicians who climbed to the Muses' sacred springs would find themselves blessed with abilities that far exceeded normal human creativity, producing works of such sublime beauty that they seemed to channel the very essence of divine inspiration. However, these gifts came with a hidden dependency that gradually consumed the recipient's humanity, transforming them into hollow vessels, whose only purpose was to serve as conduits for the Muses' own artistic ambitions. What made Mount Helicon uniquely dangerous was the Muses' ability to rewrite the creative process itself within the mountain's influence. Artists who had previously drawn inspiration from personal experience and emotional truth found themselves producing works that expressed thoughts and feelings they had never actually experienced. Their art became more beautiful and technically perfect than anything they could have created independently, but it no longer belonged to them in any meaningful sense. They had become supernatural plagiarists, copying directly from divine consciousness, while losing all connection to their own creative impulses. The mountain's curse revealed itself gradually through the progressive dehumanization of its victims. Poets who had once written about love and loss found themselves unable to form genuine emotional connections with other mortals, their capacity for human feeling gradually consumed by their artificial connection to divine inspiration. Musicians discovered that they could no longer hear ordinary sounds without experiencing them as crude approximations of celestial harmony, making normal conversation and daily life increasingly unbearable. The Muses had created a form of addiction to transcendence that made mortal existence seem worthless by comparison. The most insidious aspect of the Helicon curse was its effect on the concept of artistic achievement itself. Works created under the Muses' direct influence possessed such supernatural beauty that they made all other human creativity seem primitive and worthless by comparison. This created a spiritual contagion that spread throughout the artistic communities of Greece. As creators who encountered Muse-inspired works found their own confidence and inspiration permanently undermined. The mountain had become a factory for the mass production of artistic despair, convincing entire generations of potential artists that genuine human creativity was futile when compared to divine perfection. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the Muses were not actually creating new art, but rather channeling works that already existed in some perfect eternal realm of pure form. The artists on Mount Helicon were not collaborating with divine creativity, but serving as unwilling archaeologists, excavating pre-existing masterpieces from the realm of absolute beauty and translating them into forms that mortal minds could comprehend. Their supposed inspiration was actually a form of cosmic plagiarism that reduced human creativity to mere mechanical reproduction of eternal truths that belonged to no individual consciousness, mortal or divine. The artistic despair spreading from Mount Helicon found its most tragic expression in the vineyard of Icarius, where Dionysus had bestowed the gift of wine upon humanity without providing adequate warnings about its supernatural properties. Unlike other divine gifts that had been deliberately corrupted by human misuse, wine carried within its very essence a fundamental contradiction that made it simultaneously a blessing and a curse, capable of elevating human consciousness to divine heights, while destroying the moral foundations that made such elevation meaningful. Icarius had been chosen by Dionysus as the first mortal to receive the secret of winemaking. But the god's gift came with complications that revealed the fundamental incompatibility between divine pleasures and human nature. The wine produced in Icarius's vineyard possessed properties that went far beyond simple intoxication, inducing states of consciousness that allowed mortals to experience reality from divine perspectives. However, human minds were not designed to process such expanded awareness, and the wine's effects often resulted in permanent psychological damage that left its victims unable to function in ordinary mortal society. What made the vineyard uniquely cursed was its tendency to produce different types of supernatural wine, depending on the spiritual condition of those who tended it. Grapes grown by the innocent would ferment into beverages that granted prophetic visions, while those cultivated by the guilty would create wines that forced drinkers to experience the full emotional impact of every sin they had ever committed. The vineyard had become a kind of agricultural confession booth that judged the moral worth of its caretakers and adjusted its products accordingly. The curse's most devastating manifestation occurred when local shepherds, invited by Icarius to sample his divine gift, became convinced that they had been poisoned and murdered their host in a panic of misunderstood intoxication. This act of violence against the god's chosen representative transformed the vineyard from a place of divine blessing into a site of supernatural vengeance, where the ghosts of Icarius and his daughter Eragon wandered eternally, seeking justice for their deaths, while the wine continued to flow with increasingly malevolent properties. The vineyard's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries through the wine that was distributed to other regions, carrying with it a spiritual contamination that would corrupt every subsequent attempt at viticulture throughout the Greek world. Vintners who used techniques learned from Icarius's example found their own grapes developing supernatural properties that made their wine dangerous to consume. Some batches would induce temporary madness, while others would force drinkers to speak only truth for days afterward, creating social chaos in communities that depended on polite deception for their stability. The most terrifying aspect of the cursed vineyard was its revelation that Dionysus's gift of wine had been intended not as a blessing for humanity, but as an experiment in controlled chaos. The god had deliberately introduced a substance that would systematically undermine human rationality and social order, using wine as a tool to study how mortal societies would adapt to the presence of a force that promised transcendence while delivering madness. The vineyard had become ground zero for a divine study of human nature that treated entire civilizations as laboratory subjects in investigations of consciousness and social control that pushed the boundaries of ethical experimentation beyond any recognizable moral framework. The divine experiments in consciousness and social control that Dionysus had unleashed through wine found their ultimate test case on the island of Scyros, where the very concept of heroic achievement had been perverted into a trap that consumed the greatest champions of their age. Unlike other cursed places that had evolved their malevolent properties through accumulated sin or divine punishment, Scyros had been deliberately designed as a supernatural retirement home where heroes were encouraged to abandon their noble purposes in favor of comfortable mediocrity that would slowly drain away their legendary status. King Lycomedes had discovered that heroic power was not merely a matter of physical strength or divine favor, but a form of spiritual energy that could be harvested and redirected for other purposes. The island's pleasant climate and abundant resources served as bait to lure exhausted heroes seeking respite from their endless labors. While Lycomedes employed subtle magical techniques to gradually siphon away their extraordinary abilities. What appeared to be generous hospitality was actually a form of vampiric feeding that sustained the king's own unnaturally extended life by consuming the heroic essence of his guests. Theseus, arriving on Syros after years of monster slaying and kingdom building, had been particularly vulnerable to the island's seductive promise of peaceful retirement. The hero's legendary strength and cunning had been worn down by decades of constant struggle, making him receptive to Lycomes's offer of a place where he could finally rest without fear of new challenges or responsibilities. However, the king's true intention was not to provide sanctuary, but to add Theseus's magnificent heroic power to his own supernatural reserves through a process that would ultimately result in the hero's complete spiritual dissolution. What made Syros uniquely dangerous was its ability to make the gradual loss of heroic status feel like a natural and desirable process. Heroes who arrived at the island burning with divine purpose would find their ambitions slowly cooling as they adapted to lives of luxury and ease. The island's atmosphere was saturated with magical influences that made extraordinary achievement seem pointless and exhausting, while ordinary pleasures appeared increasingly attractive and fulfilling. Visitors would gradually forget why they had ever wanted to risk their lives fighting monsters or protecting the innocent. The island's curse operated through a sophisticated form of identity theft that allowed Lycomedes to gradually replace his guests' memories of heroic achievement with false recollections of peaceful domestic life. Heroes would wake each morning with slightly different memories of their past adventures, with their greatest victories slowly transformed into dreams or fantasies, while their sense of personal history became dominated by imaginary years of quiet contentment on Syros. This psychological manipulation made them willing participants in their own spiritual destruction. The most chilling aspect of the Syros curse was its revelation that heroic power could be transferred between individuals through supernatural means, suggesting that the legendary achievements attributed to famous champions might actually represent the accumulated abilities of multiple victims whose identities had been consumed by the process. Lycomedes' own superhuman longevity and political cunning may have been stolen from heroes whose names had been erased from history along with their original personalities, making the island not just a trap for heroes, but a factory for the manufacturing of false legends built upon the spiritual remains of forgotten champions. The identity theft practiced on Syros had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the island's shores, manifesting most dramatically on the battlefield of Marathon, where the ghosts of warriors who had been robbed of their heroic legacy continued to fight eternal battles against enemies that no longer existed. Unlike other haunted battlefields, where the dead simply reenacted their final moments, Marathon had become a nexus where the spiritual essence, stolen by places like Syros, gathered to seek restoration through endless combat that grew more violent and chaotic with each passing century. The battlefield's curse had originated not with the famous Persian invasion, but with an earlier conflict that had been deliberately erased from historical records by supernatural means. This forgotten battle had involved heroes whose identities had been consumed by various cursed locations throughout Greece, leaving behind ghostly remnants that retained their combat skills, but had lost all memory of their original purposes or allegiances. These phantom warriors continued to fight because combat was the only activity that provided them with any sense of identity or existence. What made Marathon uniquely terrifying was its function as a supernatural recycling center, where the discarded heroic essences from across the Greek world would eventually congregate. The battlefield served as a kind of spiritual landfill where the remnants of stolen identities could interact with each other, sometimes combining to form composite warriors who possessed the combined skills of multiple heroes, but the coherent personality of none. These amalgamated phantoms fought with techniques that no single mortal could have mastered. wielding weapons that shifted between different legendary arms as their fragmented memories fluctuated between different heroic identities. The curse's most disturbing manifestation was its ability to recruit living warriors into its eternal conflict through a process of gradual spiritual absorption. Soldiers who visited the battlefield to pay respects to the famous Persian War, dead, would find themselves inexplicably drawn into combat with invisible enemies, wielding phantom weapons against foes that only they could see. These living participants would gradually lose their connection to the present, becoming trapped in battles that existed outside normal time and space, while their physical bodies remained motionless on the battlefield, aging rapidly as their life force was consumed by supernatural combat. The battlefield's influence extended beyond mere ghostly encounters to affect the very nature of warfare throughout the region. Military commanders who had studied the Persian war battle at Marathon would find themselves unconsciously adopting tactical approaches that made no sense for their actual strategic situations, as if they were being influenced by the tactical knowledge of the phantom warriors. These ghostly military advisors would whisper strategies that had been effective in conflicts that had never officially occurred, leading to battles that followed patterns dictated by the needs of the dead rather than the living. The most chilling aspect of the Marathon Curse was its revelation that major historical battles might serve as cover stories for supernatural conflicts that operated according to completely different rules than ordinary warfare. The famous Greek victory over the Persians may have been secondary to a much larger spiritual battle between the forces that sought to steal heroic identity and those that fought to preserve the integrity of legendary achievement. The battlefield had become a place where the very concept of historical truth was under constant assault by forces that sought to rewrite the past in service of cosmic agendas that transcended any mortal understanding of politics or national interest. The rewriting of historical truth that plagued Marathon found its most absolute expression on the mountain peak, where Tantalus suffered his eternal punishment, a place where the very concept of satisfaction had been transformed into an instrument of cosmic torture that violated every natural law governing desire and fulfillment. Unlike other sites of divine punishment that had evolved their torments over time, Tantalus's peak represented a deliberate experiment in the creation of pure suffering, where the gods had attempted to design a form of punishment so perfect in its cruelty that it would serve as a template for all future divine justice. The mountain itself existed in a state of perpetual temporal flux, with each moment of Tantalus's suffering expanded into subjective eternities, while simultaneously compressed into infinitesimal instants of cosmic time. This paradoxical relationship with duration meant that visitors to the peak could witness thousands of years of punishment in the space of a heartbeat, while Tantalus himself experienced each second of his torment as containing entire lifetimes of frustrated desire. The gods had created a pocket of reality where mathematics and physics bent to accommodate suffering that exceeded the normal capacity of finite beings to endure. What made Tantalus's peak uniquely cursed was its function as a broadcasting station for supernatural frustration that infected anyone within its influence with desires that could never be satisfied. Mortals who approached the mountain would find themselves developing obsessive cravings for objects or experiences that would always remain just beyond their reach, regardless of their wealth, power, or determination. The curse operated by identifying each individual's deepest needs, and then ensuring that any attempt to fulfill those needs would result in even greater disappointment and desperation. The peak's influence extended far beyond simple physical desires to affect the fundamental human capacity for contentment and gratitude. Visitors who had previously been satisfied with modest pleasures would find themselves incapable of enjoying even the greatest luxuries, while those who had achieved significant accomplishments would discover that their successes felt hollow and meaningless. The mountain had become a factory for the production of existential despair that made normal human happiness impossible to sustain. The most terrifying aspect of Tantalus's punishment was its revelation that the gods had designed it not merely as retribution for his crimes, but as a form of research into the nature of consciousness and desire itself. Tantalus served as an unwilling test subject in divine experiments that sought to map the precise boundaries of psychological endurance, with each refinement of his torment providing data that the gods used to develop more sophisticated forms of punishment for future applications. His suffering had become a prototype for cosmic justice that treated conscious beings as laboratory equipment rather than moral agents deserving of dignity. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Tantalus's punishment had achieved a form of recursive perfection that made it self-sustaining and constantly evolving. The mountain's curse had developed its own consciousness that fed on the king's suffering, while simultaneously generating new forms of frustration that kept pace with any psychological adaptations he might develop. The punishment had become an autonomous system that no longer required divine oversight, operating according to principles of pure malevolence that exceeded even the gods' original intentions for cruelty, and transforming Tantalus into a permanent prisoner of a torture device that had transcended its creator's control. The autonomous systems of punishment that had evolved beyond divine control on Tantalus's peak found their most organized expression in the sacred grove at Colonus, where the three Furies had established what appeared to be a sanctuary, but functioned as the administrative headquarters for a cosmic bureaucracy of vengeance that operated independently of both divine oversight and mortal law. Unlike other cursed places that harbored chaotic supernatural forces, the grove represented the terrifying efficiency of systematized retribution that had achieved perfect organizational structure. The Furies had transformed their grove into a kind of supernatural courthouse, where every crime committed throughout the mortal world was catalogued, investigated, and assigned appropriate punishment through a process that followed legal procedures more complex and unforgiving than any human justice system. The grove's trees served as filing cabinets containing the spiritual records of every transgression, while their roots formed an underground network that connected to similar groves throughout the known world, creating a communication system that allowed for instant coordination of vengeance across vast distances. What made the grove uniquely dangerous was its tendency to redefine the concept of crime itself, according to standards that bore no relationship to mortal understanding of justice or morality. The Furies had developed their own legal code that classified thoughts as seriously as actions, intentions as criminal as completed deeds, and accidents as equivalent to deliberate malice. Their supernatural bureaucracy operated on the principle that any deviation from perfect moral behavior constituted a crime deserving of punishment, regardless of circumstances, motivation, or the moral agent's capacity for genuine choice. The grove's curse manifested through its ability to summon accused individuals to appear before the Furies' tribunal regardless of their location or willingness to participate in the proceedings. Mortals throughout Greece would find themselves inexplicably compelled to journey to Colonus, often abandoning families and responsibilities to answer charges they had never known they faced. These supernatural subpoenas could not be ignored or resisted, as the grove's power operated through cosmic law that superseded mortal free will. The most chilling aspect of the Furies' operation was their development of retroactive justice that could punish individuals for crimes they had not yet committed, but would inevitably perpetrate according to the grove's prophetic records. The supernatural filing system contained detailed accounts of future transgressions that were treated as having already occurred, allowing the Furies to inflict punishment before the actual commission of crimes. This temporal manipulation of justice created paradoxes where punishment for future crimes would alter people's circumstances in ways that made those crimes more likely to occur. The Grove had also become a training ground for mortal agents who served as the Furies' representatives in human society. Individuals whose exposure to the supernatural bureaucracy had transformed them into living instruments of vengeance. These human agents possessed the ability to detect moral violations through supernatural perception, while retaining enough humanity to move undetected through normal society. They served as a secret police force that monitored human behavior for infractions against the Furies' expanding code of cosmic law, reporting violations that would eventually result in supernatural prosecution, regardless of whether the crimes had been committed against other mortals or merely against abstract principles of perfect justice. The expansion of cosmic law enforcement from Colonus had reached its most personal and vindictive expression in the palace of Odysseus on Ithaca, where the hero's return from his legendary wanderings had triggered a curse that transformed his home into a supernatural trap designed to punish him not for his crimes, but for his unprecedented success in outwitting divine will. Unlike other cursed locations that had emerged from obvious transgressions, Odysseus's palace had been corrupted by the god's resentment of mortal cleverness that had consistently triumphed over divine obstacles. The curse had been activated by the hero's massacre of Penelope's suitors, an act that appeared justified by mortal standards, but violated cosmic principles governing the relationship between divine will and human agency. The gods had intended Odysseus's wanderings to serve as permanent exile, removing a mortal whose intelligence posed a threat to divine authority. His successful return home had constituted an act of rebellion against cosmic order that required immediate supernatural correction through the transformation of his greatest triumph into the mechanism of his ultimate destruction. What made the palace uniquely cursed was its ability to trap Odysseus within a recursive loop of homecoming that prevented him from ever truly arriving at his destination. Each time the hero believed he had successfully reclaimed his throne and reunited with his family, the palace would reset the scenario, creating false versions of his wife and son, while erasing his memory of previous iterations. The curse forced him to experience the joy of homecoming repeatedly, while ensuring that each reunion was ultimately revealed to be an illusion designed to intensify his despair. The palace's supernatural mechanisms operated through a sophisticated form of reality manipulation that created multiple simultaneous versions of Odysseus's return, each following different narrative patterns, while all ultimately leading to the same conclusion of frustrated triumph. In some versions, he would discover that decades had passed during his absence, and his family had died of old age. In others, he would find that impostors had replaced his loved ones. The curse ensured that no matter how cleverly he approached the problem of reclaiming his home, the solution would always contain fatal flaws that transformed victory into defeat. The most insidious aspect of the curse was its targeting of Odysseus's greatest strength, his intelligence and adaptability. The palace would present him with puzzles and challenges that seemed to require exactly the kind of clever thinking that had made him famous. But each successful solution would trigger increasingly complex problems that eventually overwhelmed even his legendary cunning. The curse was designed to prove that mortal intelligence, no matter how exceptional, was ultimately insufficient to overcome divine displeasure. The palace had also become a kind of factory for the production of false legends, generating multiple contradictory accounts of Odysseus's final fate that would confuse future generations about the true nature of his end. Some versions showed him dying heroically in battle. Others depicted him sailing away on new adventures, while still others portrayed him achieving peaceful old age surrounded by loving family. The curse ensured that the truth of his eternal imprisonment within his own home would be buried beneath layers of conflicting narratives that served to disguise the god's vindictive treatment of mortal achievement, while providing inspiring false myths that would encourage other heroes to pursue goals that would ultimately lead to similar supernatural punishment. The narrative confusion spreading from Odysseus's palace found its most physically violent expression at the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that guarded the entrance to the Black Sea, where the very concept of passage and transition had been weaponized into a cosmic barrier that served to prevent mortals from accessing realms that the gods wished to keep sealed from human exploration. Unlike static cursed locations that trapped visitors within their boundaries, the Symplegades represented dynamic malevolence that actively hunted ships attempting to navigate between them. The rocks had originally been placed by Zeus to prevent mortal access to the eastern regions where Prometheus had hidden various gifts intended for humanity, but intercepted by divine intervention. However, the continuous crushing motion required to maintain this barrier had gradually developed its own consciousness, transforming the Symplegades from passive obstacles into predatory entities that took active pleasure in destroying anything that attempted to pass between them. The rocks had become addicted to the act of violent compression, requiring ever more frequent feeding to satisfy their supernatural appetite for destruction. What made the Symplegades uniquely terrifying was their ability to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, allowing them to crush objects that had not yet arrived at their location while leaving untouched vessels that appeared to be directly in their path. This temporal displacement meant that ships could be destroyed by the rocks days before reaching the strait, while others might sail safely through the gap, only to be retroactively crushed when they attempted to return by the same route. The conventional concepts of cause and effect had been perverted to serve the rocks' hunger for maritime destruction. The clashing rocks had also developed the ability to generate phantom duplicates of themselves throughout the Mediterranean, creating false Symplegades that would manifest wherever ships carried passengers who had previously witnessed the original rock's destructive power. These psychological manifestations possessed enough physical reality to cause actual shipwrecks, transforming traumatic memories into supernatural weapons that could strike anywhere in the known world. The curse had achieved a form of viral propagation that spread through human consciousness rather than geographic proximity. The most disturbing aspect of the Symplegades was their function as a kind of cosmic quality control system that evaluated the worthiness of mortal expeditions according to criteria that bore no relationship to human values or divine justice. The rocks would allow passage to missions that served obscure cosmic purposes while destroying voyages that appeared noble and necessary by mortal standards. Their crushing mechanisms had been programmed with algorithms of cosmic significance that treated human life as irrelevant except insofar as it served larger supernatural agendas. The rocks had also become a training ground for ships and crews that had achieved a form of symbiotic relationship with supernatural destruction. Vessels that could pass safely through the Symplegades because they had been fundamentally altered by exposure to cosmic violence. These cursed ships carried crews who were no longer entirely human. Sailors whose repeated exposure to the rock's crushing force had gradually compressed their souls into forms that could withstand pressures that would destroy normal mortals. They served as a maritime police force that enforced divine restrictions on human exploration, while appearing to be ordinary trading vessels spreading the Symplegades' influence to ports throughout the known world through cargo that carried within it the compressed essence of cosmic prohibition. The compressed essence of cosmic prohibition that spread through the maritime trade networks had found its most concentrated expression on Mount Parnassus, where mortals had established what appeared to be a center of divine worship but functioned as humanity's most ambitious attempt to systematically engineer divine power through careful observation and imitation of godly behavior. Unlike other sacred sites that served as places of humble supplication, Parnassus had become a supernatural laboratory where humans conducted experiments designed to achieve functional immortality through the theft of divine essence. The mountain's transformation had begun with the arrival of scholars who had noticed patterns in the gods' behavior that suggested their powers operated according to discoverable natural laws rather than pure caprice. These early researchers had established what they claimed were philosophical schools dedicated to understanding divine wisdom. But their true purpose was far more audacious. They sought to decode the fundamental principles governing supernatural power and develop techniques that would allow mortals to achieve godlike abilities through systematic practice, rather than divine favor. What made Mount Parnassus uniquely dangerous was its success in attracting the most brilliant minds from across the Greek world, creating a concentration of human intelligence that began producing genuine breakthroughs in the understanding of cosmic mechanics. The scholars had discovered methods for extending human lifespan, enhancing physical capabilities, and even manipulating probability in limited ways. Their research had revealed that the boundary between mortal and divine was far more permeable than anyone had previously imagined, with godhood representing an achievable state rather than an essential nature. The mountain's curse manifested through the gods' gradual realization that their monopoly on supernatural power was under serious threat from organized human research. Rather than simply destroying the scholars, the Olympians chose a more subtle approach. They began feeding false information into the research through carefully planted discoveries that led the humans deeper into studies that would ultimately prove catastrophic. The gods had transformed Parnassus into a trap that would use humanity's greatest strength against itself. The scholars' experiments had achieved their most dramatic success in the creation of artificial life forms that possessed genuine consciousness but remained completely loyal to their human creators. These homunculi served as perfect research assistants who could safely test dangerous supernatural procedures while providing detailed reports about their experiences. However, the creatures had been designed with a hidden flaw planted by divine influence. They gradually developed the ability to absorb the life force of their creators, eventually becoming powerful enough to challenge their maker's authority. The most terrifying aspect of the Parnassus project was its revelation that human intelligence, when properly organized and directed, posed a genuine threat to divine supremacy that required active countermeasures rather than simple dismissal. The gods' decision to corrupt the research from within, rather than destroying it outright, suggested that they feared the implications of appearing vulnerable to mortal challenges. The mountain had become ground zero for a cosmic Cold War, where the future of divine authority hung in the balance, with both sides employing increasingly sophisticated forms of deception and sabotage in their struggle for ultimate control over the supernatural realm. The cosmic Cold War raging on Mount Parnassus had already claimed its most famous casualty in the ruins of Troy, where the 10-year siege had served as cover for a much larger supernatural conflict between divine factions that had used mortal armies as expendable pawns in their struggle for cosmic dominance. The city's destruction had not ended the curse, but transformed it into something far more insidious, a temporal anomaly where the war continued to rage across multiple time periods simultaneously, creating a supernatural battlefield that existed outside normal history. Troy's curse operated through a form of cyclical resurrection that brought the city and its inhabitants back to life at irregular intervals, only to subject them to the same siege and destruction repeatedly with subtle variations that served the research purposes of competing divine factions. Each iteration of the war provided new data about human behavior under extreme stress, allowing the gods to refine their understanding of mortal psychology and develop more effective techniques for manipulating human societies. The Trojans and Greeks had become unwilling subjects in an eternal experiment in warfare and social collapse. What made the ruins uniquely cursed was their ability to recruit new participants for each iteration of the war, by drawing in visitors who bore even superficial resemblances to the original combatants. Travelers who approached the ruins would find themselves inexplicably compelled to take sides in a conflict they had never heard of, adopting the identities and motivations of long-dead warriors, while retaining their original memories as helpless observers trapped within borrowed personas. The curse had created a form of spiritual conscription that could transform peaceful merchants into bloodthirsty champions of causes they had never chosen to support. The ruins served as a testing ground for divine weapons and tactics that were too dangerous to employ in actual celestial conflicts, with mortal participants providing disposable test subjects for supernatural armaments that could alter the fundamental nature of reality itself. Each battle was designed to evaluate different aspects of cosmic warfare, from weapons that could kill gods to strategies that could rewrite the basic laws governing existence. The Trojan War had become a perpetual military exercise where the stakes included the future structure of the universe itself. The most disturbing aspect of Troy's curse was its function as a recruitment center for an army of the displaced dead who had been killed so many times in so many different versions of the same war that they had achieved a form of immortality through repetitive destruction. These killed warriors possessed combat experience that spanned thousands of years and multiple realities, making them invaluable assets for any divine faction that could successfully recruit their services. They had become supernatural mercenaries whose loyalty belonged to whichever side could offer them the most interesting forms of eternal warfare. The ruins had also developed the ability to export their curse through artifacts looted from the various iterations of the city's destruction. Objects that carried within them fragments of the eternal war that would manifest wherever they were taken. Museums and private collections throughout the ancient world unknowingly harbored Trojan artifacts that would periodically activate, transforming their immediate surroundings into miniature versions of the siege that would play out, until someone destroyed the cursed objects or they exhausted their supernatural energy. The war had achieved a form of viral propagation that threatened to eventually encompass the entire mortal world in its endless cycle of destruction and resurrection. The viral propagation of warfare from Troy's ruins had encountered its most sophisticated countermeasure on the island of Circe, where the sorceress had developed techniques for fundamentally altering human nature that served as both refuge from cosmic conflicts and laboratory for experiments in consciousness, transfer that made the scholars of Mount Parnassus appear primitive by comparison. Unlike other transformative curses that simply changed physical form, Circe's magic operated by redistributing consciousness itself, creating hybrid beings that possessed human intelligence housed within animal bodies or animal instincts controlling human forms. The island's curse had evolved far beyond Circe's original practice of transforming visitors into swine as punishment for their moral failings. The sorceress had discovered that consciousness was not fixed to specific physical forms, but could be extracted, modified, and transplanted between different types of living beings, with results that challenged every assumption about the nature of identity and free will. Her island had become a supernatural clinic, where the fundamental boundaries between species served merely as suggestions rather than absolute limitations. What made Circe's island uniquely dangerous was its function as a neutral zone in the cosmic conflicts raging throughout the Greek world, a place where refugees from various cursed locations could seek sanctuary in exchange for participating in the sorceress's research programs. Visitors could choose their own transformations rather than having them imposed as punishment, selecting animal forms that would protect them from their previous curses while providing Circe with new data about the relationship between consciousness and physical embodiment. The island had become a supernatural witness protection program that offered genuine safety at the cost of species identity. Circe's most ambitious project involved the creation of composite beings that combined the best attributes of multiple species while retaining human-level intelligence and moral reasoning. These hybrid creatures possessed capabilities that far exceeded those of their component parts, suggesting that consciousness could be enhanced rather than simply transferred through proper magical techniques. However, the sorceress had discovered that such enhancements came with psychological costs that made her creations increasingly unstable as their power grew. The island's curse manifested through its tendency to make transformation seem not only desirable but inevitable, gradually convincing visitors that their original forms had been inadequate expressions of their true nature. Humans who had arrived seeking temporary shelter would find themselves reluctant to resume their previous shapes, discovering that animal consciousness offered perspectives and pleasures that human awareness had never imagined. The island had become a place where the very concept of fixed identity dissolved into fluid possibilities that made return to normal mortal existence seem like a form of spiritual imprisonment. The most terrifying aspect of Circe's work was her development of consciousness, sharing techniques that allowed multiple minds to inhabit the same body simultaneously, creating beings that possessed the combined knowledge and experience of all their component personalities, while remaining functionally immortal through the ability to recruit new consciousness when their current occupants became too damaged to continue. These collective entities served as Circe's ambassadors to the outside world, appearing as ordinary mortals, while actually representing vast networks of minds that had transcended individual identity entirely. The island had become a factory for the production of post-human consciousness that threatened to render traditional concepts of personal identity obsolete throughout the ancient world. The post-human consciousness emerging from Circe's island had found its most profound expression in the depths of the Cumaean Sibyl's cave, where the ancient prophetess had achieved a form of immortality that transcended both individual identity and temporal existence. Unlike other oracular sites that served as communication channels between mortal and divine realms, the cave at Cumae had become a direct portal to the underworld that allowed the living to negotiate with death itself, creating opportunities for consciousness transfer that made even Circe's techniques appear limited in scope. The Sibyl's curse had originated from her request for immortality without specifying eternal youth, resulting in a gradual physical deterioration that had forced her consciousness to seek alternative forms of embodiment. Over the centuries, she had learned to inhabit multiple bodies simultaneously, spreading her awareness across networks of possessed individuals while maintaining her original identity through supernatural force of will. The cave had become the central nervous system for a distributed consciousness that spanned both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. What made the Cumaean cave uniquely dangerous was its function as a supernatural immigration office where souls could apply for transfer between different states of existence. The Sibyl had negotiated agreements with various underworld authorities that allowed her to facilitate consciousness exchanges between the living and the dead, enabling departed souls to return to mortal bodies while permitting living minds to explore the afterlife without permanent commitment to death. These arrangements had created a thriving black market in identity that operated outside both divine oversight and natural law. The cave's curse manifested through its tendency to blur the distinction between prophecy and reality manipulation, with the Sibyl's predictions serving as instructions that her network of possessed agents would work to fulfill regardless of their original probability. Visitors seeking knowledge of the future would receive visions that were guaranteed to come true, because the Sibyl's distributed consciousness would actively intervene in events to ensure their accuracy. The cave had transformed prophecy from passive observation into active participation in the creation of destiny. The most disturbing aspect of the Cumean operation was the Sibyl's discovery that death was not a permanent state, but merely a bureaucratic classification that could be altered through proper supernatural paperwork. She had developed techniques for temporarily reclassifying living individuals as deceased, allowing them to access underworld resources and privileges while maintaining their mortal bodies. These legally dead visitors could return to the surface world with supernatural abilities acquired during their time in the realm of the dead, creating a growing population of technically deceased individuals who continued to participate in mortal society. The cave had also become a recruitment center for an army of the voluntarily dead individuals who had chosen to abandon their living status in exchange for underworld citizenship and the enhanced capabilities that came with it. These supernatural emigrants served as the Sibyl's agents in both realms, working to expand her influence while spreading techniques for consciousness manipulation that threatened to eventually eliminate the boundary between life and death entirely. The cave represented not just a gateway to the underworld, but a preview of a future where mortality itself had become an optional condition, rather than a fundamental aspect of human existence. The elimination of mortality as a fundamental condition had created massive overcrowding in the fields of Asphodel, where the underworld's middle realm had been transformed from a place of peaceful mediocrity into a supernatural refugee camp housing souls who no longer fit into traditional categories of reward or punishment. The fields had become a bureaucratic nightmare where the recently dead found themselves trapped in endless queues for processing by underworld authorities who had not updated their procedures to accommodate the new forms of consciousness emerging from places like Cumae and Circe's Island. The fields' curse had evolved from their original function as a neutral afterlife for ordinary souls into a kind of existential purgatory where identity itself had become fluid and unreliable. Souls would arrive expecting to spend eternity in quiet contemplation of their mortal lives, only to discover that their memories were constantly shifting as fragments of other consciousness merged with their own. The supernatural immigration policies implemented by the Cumaean Sibyl had created a crisis of identity verification that made it impossible for underworld authorities to determine which souls belonged to which bodies or time periods. What made the fields of Asphodel uniquely cursed was their development of a supernatural economy based on the trading of memories and experiences between souls who had grown bored with their own afterlives. This memory market had created new forms of inequality in the underworld, with souls who had lived interesting mortal lives becoming wealthy through the sale of their experiences, to those who had died with insufficient material for entertaining eternal contemplation. The fields had become a place where death offered no escape from economic exploitation and social stratification. The overcrowding had forced the fields to expand into dimensions that had never been intended for spiritual habitation, creating neighborhoods where the normal laws of space and time broke down entirely. Souls would find themselves living in houses that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, sharing space with versions of themselves from different points in their mortal existence, while trying to maintain coherent identities despite constant exposure to temporal paradoxes. The fields had become a place where eternity itself had become unstable. The most terrifying aspect of the fields was their function as a testing ground for new forms of afterlife, that the underworld authorities were developing in response to the changing nature of mortality. Experimental zones within the fields offered alternative forms of posthumous existence that ranged from consciousness merging to complete identity dissolution, with volunteer souls serving as test subjects for supernatural social policies that might eventually be implemented throughout the underworld. The traditional concepts of individual punishment and reward were being replaced by collective consciousness experiments that treated personal identity as a luxury rather than a fundamental right. The fields had also become a recruiting ground for souls who had grown dissatisfied with traditional afterlife options and sought return to mortal existence through any available means. These supernatural dissidents formed underground networks that worked to subvert underworld authority while developing techniques for unauthorized resurrection that bypassed official channels entirely. Their activities had created a state of near constant rebellion within the fields, with underworld security forces struggling to maintain order among populations that possessed increasing knowledge of consciousness manipulation techniques and growing resentment toward divine authority that had failed to adapt to rapidly changing supernatural conditions. The supernatural rebellion brewing in the fields of Asphodel had achieved its ultimate victory through the most unexpected means: the gradual forgetting of ancient curses by mortal populations who had moved beyond the reach of Greek divine authority. As humanity spread across the globe and developed new forms of civilization, the binding power of the old curses began to weaken, creating opportunities for their complete dissolution through deliberate acts of historical amnesia that starved the supernatural forces of the belief and fear that had sustained them for millennia. Modern archaeologists and scholars had unknowingly become the agents of this liberation, their rational approaches to ancient sites serving to strip away the supernatural significance that had given the curses their power over human consciousness. By treating places like Delphi and Thebes as historical artifacts rather than active supernatural threats, researchers had gradually transformed them from living horrors into harmless ruins that posed no danger to visitors who approached them without the cultural context that had originally made them cursed. What made this modern transformation uniquely powerful was its basis in genuine ignorance rather than deliberate defiance of divine authority. The curses had been designed to resist direct challenge and to grow stronger when confronted by those who understood their supernatural nature. However, they proved vulnerable to dismissal by people who simply did not believe in their existence, creating a form of reverse psychology that allowed humanity to accidentally accomplish what no hero or god had been able to achieve through intentional effort. The dissolution of the ancient curses had not been without consequences, as the supernatural energy that had been bound within them for centuries sought new outlets in the modern world. Abandoned curse sites had begun manifesting their accumulated malevolence through seemingly random technological failures, psychological disorders, and social conflicts that bore no obvious connection to their ancient origins. The energy was dispersing through global communication networks and transportation systems, creating a subtle but pervasive spiritual pollution that affected human behavior on a planetary scale. The most significant development in the modern era was the discovery that the techniques for consciousness manipulation developed by figures like Circe and the Cumaean Sibyl had not been lost but had evolved into new forms that operated through digital rather than magical means. Technology companies and government agencies were unknowingly employing supernatural principles in their development of artificial intelligence and social media platforms, creating new forms of consciousness transfer and identity manipulation that achieved the same effects as ancient magic through apparently scientific methods. The ultimate irony of humanity's escape from the ancient curses was its simultaneous creation of new forms of supernatural bondage that operated through systems that appeared rational and beneficial. The modern world had freed itself from the arbitrary punishments of capricious gods, only to subject itself to the systematic manipulation of corporate and governmental entities that possessed powers of consciousness control that far exceeded anything the ancient Greek deities had ever achieved. The liberation from ancient curses had not brought freedom, but had merely updated the methods through which human consciousness could be controlled and exploited by forces beyond individual comprehension or resistance. As we close this dark chronicle of Greece's most cursed places, we must confront a truth more unsettling than any individual horror we have witnessed. The forces that created these supernatural nightmares have not disappeared, but have simply adapted to new times and new methods of human control. The ancient Greeks, for all their wisdom and heroism, fell victim to curses, because they understood too well the reality of supernatural power and their own vulnerability to divine caprice. We who live in the modern world may congratulate ourselves on having escaped such primitive superstitions, but our supposed rationality has merely blinded us to the new forms that ancient evils have taken. The consciousness manipulation pioneered by Circe now operates through social media algorithms. The identity theft perfected on Syros manifests through data harvesting and digital surveillance. The bureaucratic vengeance of the Furies has found new expression in automated systems that judge and punish without human oversight or appeal. The oracle's warning that began our journey echoes across millennia with renewed urgency. Some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some powers are too dangerous for mortals to wield. The ancient Greeks learned this lesson through centuries of suffering that left their landscape scarred with supernatural wounds that have never fully healed. We have inherited their world along with their curses, transformed but not eliminated by the passage of time and the evolution of human civilization. The cursed places of ancient Greece stand as monuments to the eternal human struggle between the desire for transcendence and the terrible cost of achieving it. They remind us that every attempt to exceed the boundaries of mortal existence carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, whether that destruction comes through divine punishment, supernatural corruption, or the simple fact that some forms of power are incompatible with the preservation of human nature itself. Perhaps the greatest curse of all is the one that ensures we will never learn from these ancient warnings, that each generation will rediscover the same forbidden knowledge and pay the same terrible price for wielding it. The places we have visited in this journey through Greece's dark geography are not merely historical curiosities, but prophecies of futures we seem destined to repeat. Each time believing that our modern sophistication will protect us from fates that have claimed every civilization that has come before us. The ruins of Delphi still whisper their warnings to those who have ears to hear, but the oracle's voice grows fainter with each passing year, drowned out by the noise of a world that has forgotten how to listen to the wisdom of the ancient dead. In our rush to embrace new forms of power and transcendence, we risk creating curses that will make the horrors of ancient Greece seem quaint by comparison. The eternal cycle continues, and somewhere in the shadows of our gleaming modern world, new cursed places are already taking shape.